Now that we can do this, it's not going to replace psychometrics, but it's going to allow us, like we said before, to triangulate better conclusions about test takers. And that's our goal. So we want to make claims that are valid about people, about what they know and can do based upon constructs that we think are important and measurable.
Welcome to the ACT Next Navigator podcast. I'm Adam Burke. Today we're talking about using EyeTracking data to evaluate and validate assessment and testing. EyeTracking, what is it? Why do you want to know about it? Eye movement is a good way to tell how people think and even how much they are thinking. Saccades, fixations, and blinks are all part of eye tracking. Saccades are the eye movements we make when reading and dreaming, like in REM sleep. Our eyes make over 100,000 saccades per day, including while reading or when we're dreaming. Another part of eye tracking is pupillometry, the measurement of pupil dilation. The pupil is controlled automatically by the body and nervous system. The size changes and acceleration of pupil dilation can be interpreted to measure thinking and cognitive effort. Our guest today is Jay Thomas. He's a senior assessment designer with ACT Next. Before he joined ACT, he worked with Kaplan Test Prep, and he was a science teacher for 19 years. Later in the show, we'll talk about his classroom experience. Jay presented a Tech Talk, which is ACT's version of a TED Talk, in September 2019. He mentioned that AERA, APA, and the NCME call for evidence of cognitive processes, including eye tracking, to validate assessment in their publication, The Standards for Educational and Psychological Testing.
You can train people to lower their heart rate. You can train people to beat a lie detector because there are both sympathetic and parasympathetic parts of blood pressure and heart rate and things like that you can learn to control. Pupils are not one that you actually have any kind of conscious effort of, I'm not going to let my pupil dilate. Mm-hmm. Your pupil naturally dilates whenever you are engaged in cognitive effort. And the faster it dilates, so the speed and the acceleration is able to be analyzed by the software to find out exactly how much instantaneous effort you're giving. And it's not something that you can teach people to beat, unlike other physiological measures that you might be able to do.
Is pupillometry a subset or a part of eye tracking?
Yes. So when you think about traditional eye tracking, there's a lot of different kinds of things you can do. The most basic and easy to understand is a heat map, which will, based upon the percentage of time that an individual looks at a particular part of a piece of paper or a screen, one color will indicate a large percentage of time, and white space indicates no looks in that area. And this is used a lot by web designers and user experience folks to determine whether or not the way that they've designed their web pages are going to work. So for instance, Google and Apple and Amazon spend a lot of money on eye tracking research to make certain that wherever they're putting their ads or the buy now sort of things is going to draw enough attention that's going to draw enough revenue, which that's really what's driven a lot of innovation in eye tracking equipment and research, is this idea of user experience and web design. Only in the last few years has it become something that we can use in testing, because now we can do the same thing with a student or any kind of test taker with an item, and we can go, wow, that person spent a lot of time on the foils instead of looking for the answer in the graphic or in the passage. And we can really get a very quick and obvious picture tells 1,000 words view of the differences between, say, someone with high literacy skills or high graphic literacy skills or high math skills and someone with low skills in those areas, because they don't look at the same information. And then in addition to that, you have sequence maps, which plays out like a movie. So it shows you where they looked in what order. You can see how people answer the question and whether or not it matches what you propose that someone with high skills would do. So for instance, if you think about the way that somebody with high graphic literacy skill would approach an assessment item, or how a graphic literacy task at work, you're going to look at the graphic and you're going to make sense of it, and then you're going to look at the question that you need to find and go, oh, I need to find that part of the graphic, and you're going to go scan and look for it, and you're going to do that. The reading one was the one that just blew me away the first time I saw it. A good reader in English or any other language that reads left to right will predominantly have fixations on particular words and then jump from left to right to the next word, and then they will jump backwards, what's called a retrograde saccade, to words that they need to make better sense of something that they understand. And then they'll go left, right, and down, and so on. Okay. And people who are very poor readers don't do that. And particularly in a testing situation, what we found was they used a word search technique where they found a word in an answer and they went hunting for that word in vertical scans and didn't read horizontally like you would to understand a passage. Oh, I need a word with a K in it. I'm going to go find the only 12 Ks in the word search. I wish we had asked the question, is this the way that you read normally? Because we're not certain whether that's maladaptive testing behavior or this is the way this person reads normally, that they don't read left to right all the time, and that they're just scanning for keywords that they might help them to do something. So in our future research, we have those questions planned. Is this the way that you would normally read like a textbook for your class or an article that you had to read for something, so that we can maybe draw some more claims about that. But having never done the research before, because to be perfectly honest, eye tracking research in testing, people have been writing about it for, ETS had an article in 1969 saying that we should be doing this, and it's been in the standards in the last 2 editions of the Standards of Educational Testing have mentioned that evidence of cognitive processes, including eye tracking, should be done to validate assessment. It's been there, but people don't do it because up until recently, the equipment is just very, very expensive.
I asked Jay how eye tracking goes beyond psychometrics to provide validity and illustrations of cognitive thought processes.
Psychometrics can tell you about what percentage of a population got it right and how the different groups of the population, quintiles or thirds or however you want to do the psychometrics, are different from each other. But they don't tell you about the actual processes that people got to those answers. Did they get to the answers because they know how to do the math or because they've learned some trick in test-taking skills? The other part of it is that in psychometrics, the assumption is that if very few people get something right, so the p-value is low, or in IRT, the b parameter is high, then you would say that item is difficult. However, it ignores the effects of good teaching. Good teaching can take something that's very cognitively complex and a complex construct, and if it's taught well, those students will get it right at a very high percentage of the time, which would make a psychometrician go, oh, that's easy. This class, 90% of the students got it right, and therefore it's an easy task. But it's not an easy task, it's just a well-taught task. And that's one of the problems with psychometrics, is that it ignores the impact of quality instruction by thinking that everything's going to be along some sort of a bell curve. The idea is that when you are designing assessments, that you should have given forethought to the claims that you're going to be making about test takers and how the constructs that you want to measure are related to those claims and how they give you evidence that they can do and know what you say they know and can do and why it's relevant to whatever claims you want to make. So for instance, if you are going to make claims that students understand three-dimensional science based upon NGSS, you need to have assessment items and tasks that together ask about all 3 strands, so about practices, about cross-cutting concepts in science, and about scientific knowledge. And that if you only ask about one of those 3, then you haven't found out information that you can make claims about what students know and can do about all 3 of those. And so you really want to come in with this kind of scientific approach of what evidence do I need to make claims about whatever I'm going to do. So if you think about kind of the Toolman claim evidence reasoning argumentation model, it's really applying that in a scientific way to assessment. If you look at the standards and you think that there are 5 parts of validity, and validity is really about the claims you're going to make about test takers, about what they know and can do. Okay. The psychometric research has always been very easy to collect. You can pre-test an item to 2,000 people. You can embed it. You can do all those sorts of things. You can apply classical theory. You can apply IRT. You can apply all sorts of other sorts of ways of getting evidence about reliability and those sorts of things. But they don't tell you anything about how people got to that answer, those cognitive processes. what they discovered a very, very long time ago was that when you are engaged in cognitive effort, your pupils will rapidly dilate. And this is in contrast to the slow constriction you get when you're exposed to a bright light.
Okay.
So your pupils rapidly dilate, and for a long time, what they would do is they would give you like some memory task. So they would take you into a dark room, and they would put your head in something that would not allow it to move so they could get a really good picture. And in this dark room, across the room from you, on a screen, they would shine up like a list of 10 letters. And then they would wait 5 seconds and say, okay, now recall it. And every half second, they would take a picture of your pupils. And based upon the diameter of your pupil, they said the bigger the diameter got, the more cognitive effort you were engaging in. Well, there's a couple problems with that, and a lot of them in terms of testing, and that you can't put somebody in a taxonomic shell where their head is locked into a vise so they can't move it left and right, and give them the test in a dark room and take a picture every half second. Part of the problem was because of those limitations, there were really a lot of memory, quick math, gave you two-digit numbers to multiply, those sorts of things. And they were only dealing with the final result of how big the pupil was. And so they would take all these pictures, and somebody would take a micrometer or a caliper, and they would blow up the pictures, and they would measure how big the diameter of the eye was in millimeters. As the technology got better, and you could start taking 60 readings per second of somebody's eyes, or 250 or whatever. A woman by the name of Sandra Marshall, who works at the University of San Diego, came up with this index of cognitive activity that realized it's really the speed at which and the acceleration of the people that measures how much effort is. And so she built upon Kahneman and Beatty's and a bunch of other people's earlier work and came up with this measure that we're using now that's based on much better, smaller time increment measurements that we can really get at instantaneous load. For the research that we've published, 60 readings per second. And we chose that only because it matched the frame rate of the screen.
Okay. What is cognitive effort, and how do you talk about it?
So technically, the software measures your instantaneous, it's called the index of cognitive activity, and it's your instantaneous cognitive load relative to some baseline. Based upon a Fourier transformation that's inside the software, they can determine what your baseline cognitive effort is just on where your pupils go just from a change in lighting and so on. And so your instantaneous cognitive effort is based upon this increase of your pupil and the rate at which it goes. What we decided to do was to measure cognitive effort was we said that we were going to integrate that over time. So if during a particular saccade of, let's say, 0.005 seconds, that your cognitive activity was 0.65 of your maximum, we said that, okay, well then we're going to take 0.65 times 0.005, the time range, use a rectangular approximation, then add up all of those little instantaneous efforts to come up with a total effort over a task. One of the nice things about the software and this equipment is because it takes hundreds and thousands of readings for everybody as they're doing these tasks. So if you think about a typical task that takes 30 to 120 seconds. In 30 seconds, you're getting 1,800 readings of this person. So there's an awful lot of data there. Since it's all spit out in kind of a spreadsheet format, it's relatively easy to just say, okay, what's the change in time? What's the cognitive activity? Multiply them together and do a running total. And so you can measure the cognitive effort from the beginning of a task to the end of a task for each individual for each task that you give them. Anybody who's studied educational psychology or cognitive psychology, you go, okay, yeah, if I have a little bit of effort for a little bit of time, and then I have a little bit more, well, that's a little bit more effort. And then you just keep adding them up. And that when that number becomes very large, you end up with a large amount of cognitive effort. The other thing that happens that is another part of this is that there's a maximum cognitive activity that people are willing to give. Different people have called it different things, but if you think about this maximum cognitive effort that you can give, which is a function of how many things you can hold in your working memory, and your skills will determine whether or not you can do a particular task, because it might be too complex for you, because in order to do it, you would have to have way too much working memory. So I think measuring the maximum cognitive load of something is important, because that'll tell you whether or not somebody's engaging in what Kahneman would call type 1 or type 2 thinking. But I think that measure of the total cognitive effort over time is going to be really important. So we're beginning to try and work with Stephen Wise about looking at his measure of engagement, whether or not people are meaningfully engaged in an item. in a task. We would argue that if the TCE doesn't exceed a certain amount, that the person didn't engage in meaningful effort regardless of what the latency. Latency is really easy to measure with computer-based tests. You know when the item started, you know when it ended, but you don't know where they looked or how hard that they were thinking or were they just staring at the screen. Well, eye tracking allows us to know, were they engaging in meaningful effort? Were they looking at important parts of the screen or were they staring into blank space? And this total cognitive effort. So it's another way of being able to tell whether or not a test taker is engaged. It would be awesome if we got to a point where this hardware and software was integrated in the test, so we could get to a point where we could go, there's no point in wasting any more of your time. You are not actively giving us any mental effort that's going to let us know anything about what you know it can do. We know that you have tapped out. We know that the maximum you are is level X, and that we could give you all these level Z questions, and you might guess some, and we might learn something about the psychometric guessing parameters or the discrimination of that item, but we're not going to learn anything about you. Mm-hmm. And so we could use these to greatly speed up diagnostic testing to get to the point where we're not wasting time. Or we could go, wow, this person, there's so little cognitive effort, we know these questions aren't challenging to this person, let's jump to the next level. And so when you think about adaptive testing that normally is based upon, again, IRT parameters and going maximum information function, well, maybe maximum effort could be more important than the maximum information for the whole population, because then we could focus in on, this item targets these skills and this required more effort for this person to get it right. And this other one that's supposed to be equally difficult engaged almost no cognitive effort. So they must have that one fairly well mastered because they're showing evidence of mastery as opposed to novice behavior on those items. My guess is that technology is far down the road, 20, 30 years in terms of cost of
testing.
The adaptive testing that you could do that with, because it'd have to be in all of these testing devices, and we'd have to find a way that these computer-based tests don't have other things that add to cognitive effort that are going to mess things up. So is scrolling really different from reading on paper and pencil? If you have to scroll, and that means you have to have more in your working memory of what's going on, how is that going to affect your cognitive effort? And we haven't done enough comparisons of paper and pencil to computer to be able to draw those conclusions yet. So that's going to take a bunch of studies to go. Psychometrically, you could go, well, it does this or does this. But then we can look at the vision patterns and the gaze patterns and the cognitive effort to draw those conclusions. That evidence of cognitive processes, because it's timely to consume and usually has small n values. If you're doing think alouds, you can't do a think aloud on 1,000 students. It's just impractical. You can't do 1,000 students in an eye tracking with current technology. So the n values are very small, which makes them suspect to people who want, I need to have statistical significance and not just looking at these kind of trends where we're looking at it. One of the great things that was said to me by one of the psychometricians here was when we showed the difference between high scores and low scores, showed the heat map of this item, and she's like, I don't need a t-test to know that those low scores are significant, doing something significantly different from the people on the left. Whether it's statistically significant or not, the heat map tells me that there's a difference. And that's one of the problems, is that we end up sometimes a slave to the psychometric properties of statistical significance. And so you lose things in small sample sizes.
If you've listened this far, maybe you want to know about the formula for TCE, total cognitive effort, that measures thinking with the data about pupillometry. I put this TCE equation on the webpage. Jay is going to explain it a little bit further here. And I want you to kind of walk us through this formula.
Okay, so the formula, so total cognitive effort of person I. The subscripts are all about the items and the people.
So this is TCE for one item.
For one item.
Okay. And total cognitive effort.
TCE is our total cognitive effort for the item. So we've got the summation. So we're saying we're just going to add up whatever's to the right of the summation. From j equals 1 would be the first measurement to n is the last measurement. So from when the item starts till it ends. So for us, we define the item starting as when on the computer screen the entire item was on the screen and could be read.
And the page loads.
The page finishes loading completely. Okay. And we measured the end of the item as when the test taker clicked on an answer and clicked next. Because we didn't really care what was going on cognitively for them. as it was trying to send the answer and reload the next page, we consider that to be dead space because from our point of view, it really had nothing to do with what we were interested in. ICA is this index of cognitive activity that the software spits out based upon the Fourier transformation of changes in the pupil, the velocity and the acceleration changes. For J is just, so again, this would be the first measurement, and the time is the time for that measurement. So when you're doing eye tracking, you get saccades, which are rapid jumps of the eyes from one place to another. You get fixations, and fixations are when the eye moves very little over an extended period of time, usually between 0.15 and 0.3 seconds. Doesn't seem like an extended period of time, but for eye movements, when you think about the way that you actually use your eyes, that's a long time. And blinks. So every blink is measured. And so it measures, so based upon what your pupil diameter was before and after the blink, it can actually then go, okay, in order to do that, it had to accelerate at this rate and its velocity is this at this point. And so you measure, so the software will split out the time of each one of those kinds of measurements, and then you just multiply the ICA, which is a number between 0 and 1, and multiplied by the time, generally speaking in milliseconds, but you could pick any unit of time you wanted that was convenient. Milliseconds is convenient because almost all eye measurements are really, really brief in milliseconds. So for each one of those measurements, you multiply those two things together, and then you just add up the first fixation, and then there's a saccade, and then there's another fixation, and then another saccade, and then there's a blink. In a spreadsheet or using SAS or anything, it's relatively easy to just say, okay, multiply across, add down, and put in your timestamp system when you want to begin and end, and it will spit that out for each item. And to be perfectly honest, the hardest part of doing all this eye tracking research with testing is the fact that all of this equipment and software was designed for web designers. Now, at Amazon, when you click on an item, you go to a new URL. On test-taking software, the URL stays the same, and when you click on next, an applet actually loads or some sort of hidden program in the back, the URL doesn't change. So the computer and the software thinks that you haven't gone anywhere, so you actually have to manually go in and process, this is the beginning of the page and the end of the page. And one of the things that you lose is that the software is designed to automatically know where the scroll point is of the screen the moment that page loads, because it's part of the HTML data. The problem is, with the way that we do testing, is because for most programs for test security, since it's the same HTML page, that first item where that scroll line is where the computer thinks that the scroll line is for every item. And so if you have items that have different scrolling later, it becomes more difficult because you actually have to take a screenshot of the screen and then overlay the heat map on top of it. Whenever there's no scrolling, that's not an issue because you screenshot the whole screen and everything lays on perfectly in X and Y coordinates. But if there is scrolling, then your heat map is suspect to where it is. It's from here down, but I'm not certain where it is, and so you want to be very careful about how much you judge from those heat maps, other than if there's a big gap around an area, you know that they didn't look in that area before or after they scrolled. That's one of the things that comes out of.
That's a challenge.
It is a challenge.
Scrolling stuff.
Scrolling is a challenge. We have some data that we have collected that we have not yet analyzed from an NSF-funded project that we've worked on, where each page actually loads independently. So when you click on next, it actually has a new URL. I'm looking forward to doing that. We have a very small sample size. We actually went to Ann Arbor and tested a bunch of students who were going to be taking these tests in science class anyway. And this is how portable the equipment is. I was able to take the equipment, go into high schools, set up, biology teachers give the test in 3rd, 4th, and 6th bell, and just sit there and do the test have the kids collect the data. And so it'll be interesting to see how much easier it is to deal with a scrolling issue for that. Unfortunately, I don't foresee any time in the near future where that's going to become the case for high-stakes testing. I mean, there's a difference between classroom testing for formative and summative testing.
If you could go back to being a teacher, how would you teach differently? Or what would you do in assessment design for your classes? And you were a teacher for 19 years?
Yes. So I taught every kind of science except biology at some point, and I taught gifted junior high pull-out classes as well.
Okay.
And in addition to that, I taught for Kaplan test prep for 15 years as well. So I've taught junior high up through adults. One of the things that the graphic literacy thing taught me was that I would spend a lot more time teaching kids to look at axes and keys and legends to graphics, because that really was a huge jump out, obvious difference between people with high graphic literacy and low graphic literacy. And one of the problems about teaching high school and above most of the time is that you assume that they've learned certain fundamental skills to get through to where you're teaching. So that's one thing that would come out with me, particularly when you think about how much data analysis in science you want to be doing graphical analysis. So, we used phase diagrams. We would do real-time collection of data using probes for velocity acceleration and all these other sorts of things where graphical analysis was really important, and paying attention to having, what's on the axes and what's in the labels. That's something that I would spend much more time making certain that they all got it. The other thing, I would love to be able to give this to a class to see what was driving wrong answers. So, for instance, I wrote distractor-driven multiple choice. So I was looking at misconceptions. And I didn't write very many multiple choice questions because the students would do very poorly on them because they were distractor-driven. To see what they could do in chemistry and physics oftentimes would be, okay, here's something that happened, explain it. Here's a reaction. How much product should you get in a stoichiometry? If you only got this much, what was your percent yield? Analyze what went wrong with this experiment. And so there was a lot of constructed response sort of things. I would love to go back and go, why were they so bad at multiple choice? What was it about the distractors that was driving them? Beyond the fact that having read misconception research and conceptual change research, that I knew that I was picking things that were going to be targeting things where students are likely to take the wrong answer. That would be very interesting to see if you could do it. The cognitive effort piece that we've been able to quantify, I'm one of those weird people in that I had 2 psychology degrees in addition to my science degree. So I gave a lot of thought to this cognitive psychology piece of teaching and of breaking things down. One of the things that I told my students was that it's really hard to be a good science teacher or math teacher because usually you got into it because you were good at it. And the reason why you were good at it was it's intuitively obvious. The problem with something that's intuitively obvious to you is that it doesn't require a lot of mental effort. So my job was to take something that was intuitively obvious to me and to break it down into smaller components that students could cascade together, that they could link together, whether you want to talk about a spiraling curriculum, so that they build the pieces. I was very cognizant of there's only so much mental effort that they can give at any given point. So they're not going to be able to look at this whole problem and do it all at once. Like I can look at it and go, oh, that's what's going to happen. My job was to break it down into these smaller manageable pieces. It would be interesting to me to see from the beginning of a unit to the end of the unit how the cognitive effort was once they've kind of mastered, oh, I know that these steps are going to work, to see how they would learn to chunk it so it would take less mental effort to do it. But it comes back to the problem with eye tracking in general. It becomes expensive and hard to generate lots and lots of people and then a lot of post-processing time to do that. It would be awesome if we could do that. And one of the things that came up, and I mentioned it in the TED Talk, or Tech Talk that we did, was that Apple bought Sensory Motor Inc., SMI, who was, there are 3 really leading companies in doing this eye tracking research equipment for professors and researchers and people like ACT who are doing that research. And Apple surprisingly bought SMI out and then stopped doing technical support and innovations on their product that they were releasing. Their press release was very cryptic as to whether or not they were doing it so that they could do market research or so that they could do accessibility issues. Because one of the things that comes up is that for people with all sorts of mobility issues, whether it's Parkinson's or ALS, or think of anything where somebody has difficulty using a mouse or a touchpad, that eye tracking would be a great way to do that, because oftentimes that's something that even those folks with those disabilities, eye movement control can be learned and the blinks can be used as mouse clicks and things like that. And there has been done some research on that. So when they bought it, it was hard to tell whether or not they were doing this for accessibility or if they were doing it so that they could do a better job of selling things in the iTunes.
And control that.
And so one of the things that we've had to do is we've had to go to a different vendor. And going back to cost, we thought we had this great way of doing it, and we had invested a bunch of time and money and training and doing it, and now we're using different vendor because our vendor no longer exists. Now, the same thing could happen with anything when you think about when you're using a vendor to do it. Imagine if we hadn't bought Psychometrics and we were hiring them as a vendor, and somebody else bought them out and said, okay, you're not working with ACT anymore because they're a competitor. It could happen. So that's kind of what happened to us. So we've now switched to a different vendor for these things, and so we're learning. It's similar, it's the same but different. So learning new ways of doing it in the software. And once you know one, you could kind of figure out the others. But that speed of the learning curve of being able to do it very quickly is going to take some time.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Jay, for the conversation, and I also want to give credit to his collaborators, Thomas Langenfeld, Rongchun Zhu, and Carrie Morris of ACT. Have you heard about Feed Your Brain Friday? Feed Your Brain Friday is a regularly scheduled release of ACT and ACT Next research. Look for the hashtag FYBF every Friday on our Twitter and LinkedIn pages, and also look for some of this eye tracking research there too. Thank you for listening to episode 5 of the ACT Next Navigator podcast.